Good evening. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2017 Gough Whitlam Oration. My name is Leanne Smith. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute and I'll be your Master of Ceremonies for this evening. I'd like to start the proceedings tonight by inviting Uncle Greg Sims, Darug Elder, to give the official welcome to country. Uncle Greg is well known as an activist for reconciliation and an educator for Aboriginal culture. Uncle Greg's ties to the Aboriginal community of Greater Western Sydney are through his ancestral links to the Gundungurra people of the Blue Mountains and the Gadigal people of the Darug Nation. Uncle Greg, welcome to the stage.
Firstly, I would like to say good evening to all. Wanami, Mediga Godambarak. Hello, friends. It's good to see you. My name's Greg Sims. Everyone knows me as Uncle Greg. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge my Darug land. I would like to acknowledge elders past and present. We don't own the land. The land owns us. We come from Mother Earth. We are the land. And the land we're upon today belongs to the mathematical tribe of the Darug Nation, the Eel people. And I do come from Sydney, the Gadigal people, the Whale people. And where I've been residing in the last 32 years was out in the west in the Mount Druitt area, which is the mathematical tribal area of the Darug Nation. I'm one of the Aboriginal elders of Western Sydney. And to become an elder, you have to do lots and lots of work in your community before you get respect in return. And we as elders, we go out and teach how to break down barriers and build bridges. We are out there to try and turn people's lives around. And I welcome here this evening at the Riverside Theatre for the Gough Whitlam Oration for 2017. It's been a while since I've been here, but it's always nice to come back. And the thing is that myself coming from the eastern shores of Botany Bay, where I grew up, on Aboriginal Reserve, which I classify as my university campus, where my elders taught me and taught me well. They taught me all about respect, acknowledge, never be greedy, and always share. Today, I live that life. And the old people said to me, take these values and stories, plus your own, into the next generation and share. And when I made my trek out in the Western Sydney, where I got married in 86, I went out in 85, got married in 86, because I was promised to an Aboriginal woman from the mid-north coast, from the Nambucca Valley. And we got married in March the 29th, so that's not that far away, you know. It's. But the saddest thing is my wife passed on in 2000. But what a remarkable woman she was, very strong woman, and taught the girls how to do bookkeeping, how to word letters, what sort of attire to wear at certain functions and all that sort of stuff. But the thing is, I brought my saltwater culture with me out in the west and shared it with the diverse of Aboriginal people living between Blacktown and Penrith, which I believe we have well over 85 different dialects. And here I am sharing the saltwater culture with the running water and the muddy water people. But it doesn't stop there. I'm sharing the values and stories with non-Aboriginal people too, because we are all one people. It's not about you and us, it's about all of us coming together and sharing. Because when people do come to this sacred country, they forget that our people are the First Nation people of the sacred land. And they think all Aboriginal people throughout this country speaks the same language. You know, we have well over 500 dialects in this country. In New South Wales, we have well over 136. So this must have been a multicultural country before settlers came in 1788 and the ones that followed. By saying this, we are all Australians. And we as Aboriginal elders, we don't exclude people from the circle. We love people to come into the circle and share their values and stories. We will never have knowledge if we don't do this. And once we start sharing our stories, then we're heading in the right direction towards reconciliation. And I remember my Auntie Susie, she was a foster carer, and she cared for about 146 kids. She used to say these beautiful words: the music will always sound better if we use both the black and white keys. And I think it's a beautiful saying. And you know, where we live today, it's one community, many cultures. And I'd just like to say this: when I'm out and about giving talks, I support Muslim communities. I really do. And I'm sick and tired of the media stereotypes these people. And that's why the circle is there for us to come in and share our stories and values. So thank you for having me, and I'd just like to acknowledge some special people here today. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Stephen FitzGerald, Honourable, here we go, John Faulkner, and other distinguished guests. And I'd like to acknowledge, I didn't notice him on the program, and he was a very close friend of mine back in the day when we went out and we opened a courthouse in Mount Druitt, and we did a lot of work out there doing opening art places, you know, where people would come in and relax and do their artwork, and that was the Honourable Bob Davis. So, and I'd like to acknowledge other distinguished guests here and all you special people. And I'm one of the Aboriginal elders on campus at Western Sydney University. So I'm here to conduct a welcome to country, then I'm out of here. I've got to go and next time I see my doctor, he's going to send me to a hip specialist because I have to have a hip replacement. And once that's all done, I'll be right to be able to get around a bit, you know, because I'm 67 years young. Come May, I'll be 68. And I'd just like to acknowledge a dear friend of mine that's with us tonight too, Patricia Hamlet, because I know Patricia's 1 month older than me. Am I saying the wrong thing there? Still looking 22 anyways. And, but anyways, I'm here to conduct a welcome to country. And the thing is, I must say that it's taken me over 60 years to get to this level. I didn't learn yesterday and became the expert overnight, and then being, you know, and telling people what to do today. I'm still learning. At the age of 67, I am still learning. Same as everyone in this room. We never stop learning. So we need to come together and share some stories, and stories go a long way. But anyways, I'm going to give the welcome, and I'm just going to go and sit down and rest this poor old leg of mine, playing up with this. So before I give the welcome, I'd just like to say one more thing, is that when we take our next step, just remember the ones that walked this sacred land before. Tiari mara, daraka pemo, kawi maria pemo nagala ringi babana, ba naimana waranang, nai desi guy, diana gamni jaralang, nagala ringi tiari nagala ringi nagami guy, guli winin gunagal da gunagal. Dala lawi mukakat bala nagami, this lawi ni tulima gunagal. Jami tiari nagala ringi ora jomana, miriga garang barak ni na daraka pemo, disregard. This is Daruk lands, the land of our ancestors. Their spirits still walk among us. Spirits that have been here since the dream time. Our language and our culture have been passed down from generation to generation to continued unbroken culture that has extended for thousands of years. In the language of our people, we welcome you to Daruk lands. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you to Uncle Greg for that very warm welcome to country. I'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge some of those who've joined us this evening. Former Prime Minister, the Honourable Bob Hawke, members of the Whitlam family, Catherine Dovey, Anthony Whitlam and Nick Whitlam. Members of the Whitlam Board, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps from India, the Philippines and the United States, both current and former members of Parliament, as well as the University's former Vice-Chancellor, Emeritus Professor Janice Reid. And finally, I'd like to make special mention of Gough Whitlam's colleagues, Graham Freudenberg and Evan Williams, who are also with us this evening. I'd also like to make mention of those who sent us their apologies. Thank you very much. And now it's with great pleasure that I invite the Honourable John Faulkner to officially welcome and introduce our guest speaker for this evening. John?
Former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, our many other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and by paying my respects to elders past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, as Chair of the Whitlam Institute, I welcome you all to the 2017 Gough Whitlam Oration. The Whitlam Institute sits within Western Sydney University, and tonight I also want to thank and acknowledge the University and the University's leadership for its ongoing and strong support for the Institute. The Gough Whitlam Oration is our Institute's flagship event. Previous orations have been delivered by former Prime Ministers Julia Gillard and Malcolm Fraser, Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson, and Gough's friend and confidant Graham Freudenberg. We're delighted this year that Dr. Stephen FitzGerald AO will deliver the Gough Whitlam Oration on managing ourselves in a Chinese world, Australian foreign policy in an age of disruption. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen FitzGerald, more than any other living Australian, has observed and participated in the establishment and development of Australia's diplomatic relations with China. He travelled with then opposition leader Gough Whitlam to China in July 1971 as part of the Labor Party's delegation. The decision to go to China at that time to discuss diplomatic and trade relations was courageous, far-sighted and risky. Stephen FitzGerald himself has said, "There is nothing in Australian history to compare with that China visit." The only other living member of that six-man delegation, Graham Freudenberg, is with us tonight. Graham, in his wonderful memoir, A Figure of Speech, said of the delegation, "If a fortune teller had told me at the beginning of 1971 that I would go either to China or to the moon that year, I would have opted for the moon as the more likely destination." But the delegation's visit was a foreign policy triumph executed by Gough Whitlam from opposition. It was accomplished with the advice, support and expertise of Stephen FitzGerald. Ladies and gentlemen, Less than 3 weeks after Labor's 1972 election victory, on the 21st of December, Australia and China signed the joint communique establishing diplomatic relations. On the 22nd of April 1973, aged 34, His Excellency Stephen FitzGerald presented his credentials as Australia's first ambassador to the People's Republic of China. These were heady, groundbreaking days as Australia's formal diplomatic relationship with China was put in place. Recognition of the People's Republic of China symbolised Gough's commitment to ensure Australia was seen as an enlightened, independent and constructive player in the international community. In November 1973, Gough Whitlam became the first Australian Prime Minister to visit the People's Republic of China. His ministerial statement on the visit described it as, and I quote him, the successful ending of a generation of lost contact between Australia and the most populous nation on earth. This was not an immodest statement, and I only say that because not all of Gough's statements could be so described. In fact, the visit was a tour de force, and again, Stephen FitzGerald was critical to his success. In 1975, Stephen FitzGerald became the first and only Australian ambassador to North Korea. Australia's embassy in Pyongyang was open only for 7 months. After the shock of the dismissal and then the Whitlam government's defeat in the 1975 election, Stephen asked Gough what he should do. The response? Comrade, you must stand by your station. And ladies and gentlemen, Stephen FitzGerald did just that. He worked closely and effectively with the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. After life and work as a diplomat, Stephen FitzGerald has been prominent as an academic, lecturer, consultant, advisor and author. He continues to write and speak about contemporary challenges in the Australia-China relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no more authoritative Australian voice on China than Dr. Stephen FitzGerald. Please welcome him to deliver the 2017 Whitlam Institute Gough Whitlam Oration.
Looking around, I see so many familiar faces, friends, colleagues, family. I'd like to be able to acknowledge every one of you individually, but I'll just say thank you all for coming. I'm very honoured. Can I also thank you, Uncle Greg, for your welcome to country and acknowledge that we are gathered on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and I offer my respects to the Darug people's elders, past and present. Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. Thank you also, Eric Sidoti and the board of the Whitlam Institute and the Whitlam family for the privilege of giving this oration. It's not about Gough Whitlam, but it's a tribute to him as friend and mentor and exemplar in how to go about thinking critically on foreign relations. And I'll begin with Gough. In April 1973, I went to Beijing with what's now an historic Whitlam document tucked under my arm, an 8-page letter from Gough to me as ambassador. It's what might now be called a narrative, how the relationship with China was imagined, and our goals for the long term, and what I should do to go about laying down tracks to head us towards those goals. It's historic for the obvious reason that it was Whitlam writing at the outset of Australia's official relations with the PRC. But it's historic also because the central message is still germane. Gough wrote, "We seek a relationship with China based on friendship, cooperation and mutual trust, comparable with that which we have or seek with other major powers." Think about that for a moment. It doesn't say other major Asian powers. It implies Washington or London as much as Jakarta or Tokyo. Think what that would mean. It would mean a comparable familiarity in government and society, and comparable closeness, access and trust, and potential to influence, and in Gough's view also, capacity to look to our own interests and capacity to say no. He wrote, "We need to measure our actions carefully so that we do not give the Chinese the impression that we are careless of our own interests. They are themselves hard-headed realists, and it would be unnatural of them not to take advantage of us or hold us in contempt for apparent weakness." Australia has never had this comparable relationship with China. At Prime Minister level, we came some way towards it in the 1980s with Bob Hawke, who spent literally days in the company of Chinese leaders, listening, learning and persuading, to an extent that the British and US ambassadors in Beijing apparently complained that these leaders spent more time thinking about Australia than about any other country. We have not since had that kind of closeness, except briefly between Paul Keating and Vice Premier Zhu Rongji. But now, more than at any time in our history, we need a relationship with China comparable with that which we have or seek with other major powers. Why? Because we're living in a Chinese world, but we don't have a relationship to match it. Let me recall here a view Gough had from when we first met in 1967. We can't think clearly about China if we can't think clearly about the United States. In America now, we have Donald Trump, and that is the biggest wake-up call for clear thinking about America, at least since the Vietnam War years. Not that there hasn't been cause in the years between, there just hasn't been the scale of shock. Trump has not only debauched the American system and practice of government, compromised America's security and destabilised international politics. For Australia, if it didn't already think we should have a more hard-headed, more independent relationship within the alliance, Trump's ascension has laid bare the danger of our dependence, our unquestioning involvement with America's foreign contests and wars, and the delusion that our interests and America's are the same, or that the US cares about ours. And if it didn't already question aspects of the indiscriminate claim to shared values with the US, for example, America's gun culture, religion in politics, or plutocratic government, the values Trump brings to the presidency, including his assault on the values we do share and on the idea of truth, facts and integrity in public life, are an affront to ours and should be called out for what they are. As former Defence Force Chief David Hurley said, "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept." And on that score, Opposition Foreign Affairs spokesperson Penny Wong got it pretty right when she said after Trump's election that support for the alliance does not mean that we trade away our values, values like respect and equality for women, racial and religious tolerance, and economic and social openness. The alliance must be defined, she said, by the principles of democracy, freedom, and human rights. But Malcolm Turnbull and his ministers have simply walked past. This sullies our reputation, subverts any claim to principled moral or ethical example in world affairs, and makes it derisory for us to pretend to bear witness to values in dealing with other countries, like China. No one pretends we have shared values with China, certainly not the values of the ruling political order or the party state. That's been a given in our relations. But a corollary of Trump's ascension is that a relationship of influence with China is more necessary and more urgent than it has ever been. Australia must now rethink the orientation of foreign policy and the focus we give to China, Asia, and the US. Let me now explain what I mean by living in a Chinese world. One part is what the Australian public and politicians do see and perhaps understand. This is China as state, great power, paramount power in Asia, asserting a sphere of influence around its periphery, challenger to the United States, economic giant, largest trading partner of Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and significant investor in all our economies. All of those things, yes, but in the end, mostly China over there. Sure, you might say, there's been a power shift, but that doesn't mean us, here in Australia, living in a Chinese world. I think it does. But let me go to another aspect, which I'm not sure Australians do understand or even see. This is China as wellspring of influence on us. Over here, you might say. In 2007, the great Australian international relations specialist Coral Bell published an essay with the graphic title, The End of the Vasco da Gama Era, meaning we had come to the end of Western ascendancy over the non-Western world and the end of unchallenged US paramountcy. The ending of that era left no one power to define a new global era. But in Asia, we had what might be called the beginning of the Sinic era. This is not just the fact of China's wealth and power, but the influence, political and social, not just economic. The influence of China's funding, building and acquisition of infrastructure, of the very substantial flows of PRC people for tourism, business, study and migration, of enormous outflows of money, corporate and private, clean and black, of the small C culture people carry with them from the PRC, including its business culture, and in our domestic societies, the influence of China's state-sponsored activism and its seeking to rekindle a sense of Chineseness among long-standing ethnic Chinese populations. This is facilitated by the Sinosphere. Not every Chinese in China, of course, or Southeast Asia, or the 900,000 ethnic Chinese in Australia speaks Mandarin Chinese, the official language of the PRC. But Mandarin, long scattered through our region, is now reseeded and refreshed. Where once, when I first travelled in Southeast Asia, you'd be delighted if you found anyone who could speak it. Now you hear it all around you in Southeast Asian cities and towns, and in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. Chinese speakers, bloggers and tweeters can now move in our region within this linguistic space and not, unless they choose, having to leave it except momentarily at border controls. All this influence, direct and indirect, state-sponsored and spontaneous, is percolating through our region and into our societies, nudging at how we function, at our values, our decisions, and sometimes the way we think. In our universities, for example, the way they think about the golden horde of Chinese students, and where some just take the money and pass them at all costs. Now, this influence is not bad, threatening, or malign. Most is in fact benign, beneficial to us, and welcome. It's how we handle it that matters. But whichever way you regard it, it's what happens when you have a new great power and a sphere of influence, in this case magnified by China's size and mass and numbers. Let's think for a moment about how Australia is responding. Political Australia doesn't appear ready for it. Canberra politicians and certain Americophile think tanks and media that mostly retails unprocessed feed from those two seem locked still in past ways of thinking about China. As state actor, China as challenger to the United States and security concern, China as ATM, China as business as usual, and an inclination to denial at just how far this influence has gone, how pervasive is the Chinese world in ours, how different is the challenge of managing it. There are many reasons for this denial, but here are three I think important. One, it's hard for people in Australia to accept the end of the era of Vasco da Gama, hard to turn and face the fact that the flow of influence might now be the other way. Two is the failure of governments to implant in our education the study of China and Chinese. If they had, it would have given us what's missing at the top of our political and other institutions, a critical mass of leaders who know China, who understand Chinese thinking, who can imagine a Chinese world and not be intimidated by it, who can themselves think in Chinese. In the National Parliament, the sum of China literacy is close to zero, and it's not much better across our public sector institutions. Take this example. In 2016, an arm of the Commonwealth Government critical to how we manage ourselves in this Chinese world organised for senior staff an external expert briefing on the Chinese Communist Party and how it works, because, in the words of the head of that agency, they know nothing about it. In 2016. It's good that this deficit was recognised, but a quick remedial skate around a China topic doesn't give us the capacity for sustained, long-term management of ourselves in a Chinese world. A third reason is political will. Since 9/11, there has been an acceleration of the enmeshment of Australian Defence Forces and intelligence establishments with those of the United States. As Julie Bishop said exultantly in Los Angeles in January, Australian and US forces are deeply integrated, and Australian personnel are in line and command positions inside the US military. The Deputy Sheriff, embedded and compromised. More serious is the thinking that goes with it. With some exceptions, a majority of Australian politicians on both sides of politics, others involved in the policy process, and our intelligence and defence services seem to have a chronic dependence, in the sense we use that term for health and social problems, a chronic dependence on US views and assessments, and an intellectual laziness about stirring themselves to think outside the American box on everything from Iraq to Afghanistan and Syria and the Chinese world. An example is the South China Sea, where it said we have to resist a Chinese threat to freedom of navigation. There has been no Chinese threat or interruption to freedom of commercial navigation, nor will there be, because it would be crippling for China itself. What the US is really about is freedom for its military ships and aircraft to push hard up against Chinese waters, which it would not countenance near its own waters. But that's the line Australia supports. If you had any doubts about this mental dependence, it was on full display this week in the pleading anxiety of Julie Bishop in a speech in Singapore for the US to remain the indispensable strategic power in the region, and her attack on China as unsuited to be a regional leader. There's a dangerous failure of imagination here. If you can't imagine the alternative, you can't prepare for it. This is not to say we should roll over and let China tickle our tummy, but we must clear away the mental baggage of dependence so we can see China clearly, understand it in terms of our national interests, and deal with it on our terms. It's we who are living in the Chinese world, not the US, and it's we who have to work out how we respond to its disruptions. Here are 3 illustrations of how this world impacts on ours. One is the growing influence of China in our domestic society through an offensive of soft power. We're not the only target, and in itself, this kind of activity is neither new nor illegitimate. All governments do it. Questions only arise if it crosses a line to interference, infringes national interests, or challenges basic values or institutions. Most of China's soft power does not cross this line, so generally we should be relaxed about it, but vigilant for when it does. PRC-derived funds support media, student organisations, individual politicians and political parties, and activities in higher education. The money is accompanied by an effort to determine what is said and not said about China in public discussion, university teaching and the media, and to generate uncritical Australian approval of China's government and its foreign policies. Chinese diplomatic and consular officials have fronted universities and other institutions to object to particular actions or decisions with the suggestion that China will not be happy if these are not changed or reversed. Nationalistic media in China have attacked as paranoid Australian politicians who have questioned PRC influence buying. Where this gets tricky is that ethnic Chinese communities are among the primary targets, but by no means the only ones. Sam Dastyari is not Chinese, nor are the other politicians who have accepted benefit directly or indirectly from the PRC, nor the ABC, whose arrangement with China, initially unsupervised, had it broadcasting China-censored material into China in the name of Australia. Some media over the past year have dramatised the ethnic Chinese issue and, even if unwittingly, engendered anti-Chinese sentiment and distress for many Australian Chinese. I've spent a considerable part of my life urging Australia to be open to Chinese and other Asian immigration and ideas and influences, and I love the great churning of East and West you see now in families, or in the street, or on public occasions, like the recent Sydney Mardi Gras. And I don't want to see this derailed or despoiled by xenophobia. But discuss it we must. PRC agencies or local associates now have near monopoly control of Australia's Chinese language print and broadcast media and censorship of its content, and heavy influence in major Chinese online media. A recent study has found that when there are differences between Australia and China on matters touching national pride, sovereignty or territoriality, online Chinese language media actually respond with both official Chinese positions and populist nationalist sentiments, thereby tending to position the Chinese migrant community at odds with mainstream Australian society. This, the report suggests, has the potential to affect social cohesion. Chinese people are, of course, free to access English media, but evidence suggests many, if not most, students and other recent arrivals from the PRC live mainly in the Sinosphere and tend not to. A filtered view of Australia and its political system and a censored view of China, which Chinese language media presents, are not in our interests or those of our Chinese audiences. Another focus is Chinese students. There are several dozen Chinese student associations across the country with different agendas and often in conflict. But through its consular officials, the PRC directs or controls many, if not most of them, and through them exercises surveillance and at times coercion. This is not what we want the experience of our international education to be, and given the values of the government on whose behalf this surveillance is conducted, not in our national interests. Chinese President Xi Jinping has been explicit about aims. For example, calling on all Chinese overseas, making no distinction between PRC citizens and foreign citizens, to unite and work in the cause of China. This is unwelcome and distressing to many from earlier generations of Chinese settlers in Australia who simply want to be Australian, and can be troubling and divisive also for many who have only recently left the PRC. Amplifying this influence is the inflow of very significant sums of money from the PRC. Last year, this included $3.6 billion in what are called suspicious financial transactions, or black money, which the Chinese government itself is trying to stop. But clean money or black, this money pit has become a significant factor of influence in various sectors of Australia's economy and society. Whether directed at all Australians, Chinese Australians, or ethnic Chinese temporarily in Australia, this offensive on behalf of a non-democratic party state is a challenge to the Australian government. It brings Australian and PRC national interests and values into direct contention, challenging fundamentals of our society, including freedom of speech and the media and inquiry, and even our political system itself, a theme in current official PRC discourse on Western democracy. And for Beijing to suggest Australian citizens of Chinese descent should unite and serve China is a direct challenge to Australian sovereignty. In these ways, it has clearly crossed the line. We have to manage it, looking to the interests and cohesion of the whole community and the preservation and enhancement of a close working relationship with China. There is no way the United States or ANZUS are the slightest use. It can only be done if we are close enough to have voice and influence in Beijing. A second illustration concerns our close neighbours in Southeast Asia, and a Canberra view that most, if not all, Southeast Asian countries openly or privately favour the US in its contest with China. That view received a jolt in October 2016 when Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte visited Beijing, claimed the Philippines was separating from the United States, came home with a fistful of economic agreements, and reached some understandings enabling Philippines fishing to resume around the disputed Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Shortly after, Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib went to Beijing and came home with multi-billion-dollar deals, including 4 naval vessels, the first purchase of Chinese-made military equipment in Malaysian history, and funding for a new East Coast railway. Next off the rank was Vietnam, something of a fancied anti-China favourite of Washington. In January, the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Defence Minister went to Beijing and not only signed 15 agreements on cooperation, but reached a high-level agreement to manage maritime differences and protect peace and stability in the South China Sea. That's 3 of the 4 Southeast Asian claimants in that disputed sea, moving a little way towards China. Other less dramatic developments demonstrate the growing spread of the Chinese world. For example, in Indonesia, despite public spats with Beijing and long-standing suspicion of China in significant parts of the population, China in 2016 surpassed the US as source of foreign investment in infrastructure. Or in Laos, at the end of 2016, construction began on a railway to the Chinese border, part of a link that will ultimately connect Singapore with China and into the intercontinental grid that in January this year saw the first freight train from China roll into London in half the time such freight would take by sea. You see the economics, you can imagine the political dividends. None of this means these countries are exclusively casting their lot with China. What it does mean is that if the US bugle sounds for lining up against China, they will not be falling into line. Southeast Asian governments still want the US when it's beneficial and not disruptive, and they don't want military conflict between America and China. But while they each have differences with China, there are significant shifts in China's direction. And these trends challenge the Australian view of the geopolitics of our neighbourhood. A third illustration is that China is busily going about a new international architecture that constitutes a momentous challenge to the established Western and US-dominated international order. In 2015, President Obama declared, "The world has changed. The rules are changing with it. The United States, not countries like China, should right them." China is one of many countries that have urged more inclusive, representative and equitable rules. But China has also said it's not seeking to overturn the existing order, only to reform it. However, the real answer to Obama's proposition lies in the regional arrangements China has been working on with its immediate neighbours, particularly in Southeast Asia, and since 2013, the One Belt, One Road project, a grand design of such scale and reach that I suspect only China in the present age could have conceived it. Through massive infrastructure development and funding, this project would in effect reorder and redirect the flow of trade, investment, finance, energy, communication and transport, including ports, roads and railways, between China and Europe, Russia, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. China is funding this with its two policy banks, which already hold more assets, $1.8 trillion, than the combined sum of the assets of all the Western-backed multilateral development banks. And with two new global development banks, including the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the AIIB, that's another $100 billion. And with a Silk Road Fund, a Green Silk Road Fund, a China-ASEAN Fund, a South-South Climate Fund, and a South-South Development Fund, and a dozen other funds for Eurasia, Latin America, and Africa, yet another $100 billion. As of July 2016, there were more than 900 contracts in place or under negotiation, with an investment value of over $900 billion. Where the Vasco da Gama era had effectively interdicted existing intra-regional trade flows in Asia, redirecting them to Europe as centre, this project would turn that on its head. It's been likened to America's Marshall Plan in post-war Europe, perhaps even with comparable centripetal force. Critics rightly point to false starts, funding challenges, and questions about China's commitment to incorporating social and environmental factors. But there's no doubting China has moved decisively into rules-making on a scale that is potentially game-changing for the international order. The rules question has exposed the unworkability of Australia's formulaic comfort of never having to choose between the US and China. When Australia was invited to become a founding member of the AIIB, with an opportunity to be involved in making its rules, and the US sought to prevent us, we skipped from foot to foot, trying not to choose, then chose China. Oh, it was just economic, we said. But the lesson, which is surely political, is that there are issues on which we must choose China. However, the big issue for Australia in the Belt and Road is not just the economic opportunity. It's that whether China's grand design is ultimately for the general good, depends on the degree of its accommodation to principles and liberal ideas evolved within the existing international order and embodied particularly in the UN. That makes a goal for Australia of close involvement with China's rules-making not an idle option, but fundamental. When you pile all these issues up, there's a formidable case for a fresh approach to foreign policy. On one side, we have a rogue US president, and in place of order, we have disarray, unpredictability, protectionism, isolationism, great nation chauvinism, and a leader who appears ignorant of the world outside America and of how painstakingly we came to even have an international order. A president whose relations with Russia appear to have compromised the US democratic process, who deals in bully and lies, who has played with profoundly serious international issues, like Japan and South Korea getting nuclear weapons, or the future of Taiwan, or trade war, or military brinkmanship with China. On the other side, we have all the issues of China, the nature of its values, the Chinese world, and China's assertion of primacy in East Asia and a sphere of influence in its front and backyards. A reorientation of foreign policy to meet these two disruptive developments ought not to be difficult, but it will be, given the idée fixe of our politicians and their intense preoccupation with domestic politics over policy of any kind, not just foreign policy. Since becoming PM, Malcolm Turnbull has made only one dedicated visit to China and one other to attend the G20. Since the election of Donald Trump, he has met the Chinese president only at the APEC meeting in Lima. Meeting in the wings of gatherings like the G20 or APEC is no way to run a critical foreign relationship. Here's what I propose for a durable foreign policy in this age of disruption. With a commitment to democratic values and a dedication to the idea and the institutions of multilateralism, 1, China must be given the highest priority. Many analysts, and President Xi Jinping himself, have suggested China currently offers more prospect for stability, predictability and continuity than any other international player. Given the non-democratic nature of the Chinese party state, this is a disconcerting irony. But a screaming priority for Australia must be to encourage, buttress and, if possible, enlarge China's resolve to continue this way. If it does not, we are done for. For this, we need a relationship of such propinquity that we can be a frequent, sought and heeded voice in Beijing. To achieve that, we must mobilise as much political attention and diplomacy as we can, including the sustained attention of political leaders and diverting resources back to the policy and diplomatic capacity of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Forget business as usual. This is about building trust and influence. Only through this can we hope to address the issues of relationship management and the Chinese world. We must find ways into engagement with the Chinese decision-making process, with initiatives of core interest to China itself and not trivia, shopping lists or special pleading. One that should be upfront and immediate is the fallout from Trump. Despite China's restrained response, it must be internally gasping at the turn in American politics. There's nothing anti-American in Australia being a friend at court in Beijing, helping to interpret Trump, working with China, together with other Asian countries, on constructive, conflict-avoiding strategies against disaster. Two other core interests of China are Asia-Pacific trade agreements and climate change, on both of which it's offering leadership, although I'm not holding my breath for coalition government action on climate. And there's One Belt, One Road. We need a strategy to offer support, facilitation and participation in this, and a regular head of state or government consultative arrangement which would assist Australia to take advantage of the economic opportunities, but more, it could help get us into a deeper relationship with China as strategic partner. 2, a new and higher priority for China must relate to the rest of our neighbourhood. We must refocus on Asia as our primary geostrategic habitat. Japan, Korea and India, and particularly Southeast Asia. In Canberra's devotion to America's wars in the Middle East, Southeast Asia has slid from the front of its mind. We must now reignite the regional activism and the seeking and building of new forms of regional collaboration we had in the 1980s and 90s, which at that time showed our diplomacy could be smart, subtle and successful, with 3 principal goals. The immediate one is to better understand Southeast Asians' thinking on America and work alongside them on the good as well as the troubling and on mitigating any negative effects of Trump's policies. Another is to engage closely with them in their relations with China and include them where possible in ours, because we can all be more effective working collaboratively. And for the long term, we must head once more in the direction of what Paul Keating called finding our security in, not from, Asia. 3, an elevated relationship with China need not and must not be at the expense of relations with the United States. But we must get the United States right. It's been a valuable and valued relationship, and I agree with those who say we must try to stay close, using whatever political and diplomatic influence we can to try to head off damaging Trump outcomes. But Trump is a moment of opportunity to see the fallibility of dependence and adopt once more a foreign policy of independence within that relationship. We've had that in the past. James Curran, in a book published last December, At War with America, uses the term self-reliance, which may have greater utility since independence is so routinely maligned as rejection of the US alliance, anti-American, or even treason. But whatever we call it, self-reliance must entail withdrawal from military engagement in the Middle East and from collaboration in containment of China, and rejection of any further involvement in US policies that are not in our interests, violate our values, deflect us from our primary geostrategic region and/or threaten the stability and security of our world. It requires untangling defence entanglements which have the potential to involve us in a US conflict, including the US Marine base in Darwin and the use of Pine Gap for purposes where Australian interests do not align with America's, or as one analyst has put it, for operations which are repugnant and strategically dangerous, most obviously drone assassination targeting and planning for nuclear war operations. This may seem hard, but it's possible. The subtitle of Curran's book is Why Saying No to the US Wouldn't Rupture the Alliance, and he adduces much evidence to prove it. At about the same time as Curran published that book, John Menadue, himself once private secretary to Whitlam and later head of his Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, ran a series of articles on his blog by a dozen or more foreign policy analysts, academics, former ambassadors and heads of department, with together an extraordinary combined wealth of foreign affairs experience in Asia and Washington, in which they detail numerous episodes in history when Australia has said no to the United States, all the way back to the Conservative Menzies government in the 1950s, without rupturing the relationship. And not just no to this or that issue like the AIIB, but no to the whole assumption of a dependent relationship that does not place our own interests first. We can do so now if we wish. 4, a refocused foreign policy must be led in person by the Prime Minister, in Asia generally, but above all in China, on the ground, face-to-face, proactively and frequently, supported by senior ministers. That's a huge commitment, which demands a level and frequency of access that competes with other priorities of Chinese trying to run a country of 1.4 billion and a visionary project that spans the globe. But the stakes are Australia's future, and if the government is content to sit on its hands, we must not sit on ours. The platforms we have in place for China have failed to engage the Prime Minister. So what do we do? Government and opposition must be pushed from several directions. Those many in business who see the issues must caucus together and use their influence with Canberra. And the many foreign policy specialists who have renewed public calls for an independent or self-reliant foreign policy in recent months must organise to mobilise public opinion, press their case in Canberra and collaborate with business. I think we also need an independent, high-level, high-powered Council on Foreign Relations to generate an informed critical mass and force attention to the issues. We should also support two new proposals for high-level mechanisms specifically with China to focus government attention and assist in driving policy. One is in a joint report to the Australian and Chinese governments by the ANU and an influential think tank in Beijing, which recommends an Australia-China Commission, similar to the Australian-American Fulbright Commission. This seems to have stalled in Canberra, and we must urge its implementation. Another is from China Matters, an independent forcing house for ideas on China relations, which is already engaging senior government officials on policy discussion. In a book to be published this month, called China Matters, Getting It Right for Australia, the authors advocate a somewhat different but complementary national peak body with a mandate to advance the Australia-China relationship in an unpredictable and challenging environment. And I have separately suggested a new consortium of Australian and Asian think tanks to collaborate in drawing our respective governments into intellectual and policy engagement with the challenges and opportunities of the Chinese world. To conclude, the message of Germany's Angela Merkel after Trump's election should be etched in the annals of Western democracy for the year 2016. Germany and America, she said, are connected by values of democracy, freedom and respect for the law and the dignity of man, independent of origin, skin colour, religion, gender, sexual orientation or political views. It is based on these values, she said, that I wish to offer close cooperation. That's upfront, direct to Donald Trump. Australia must have closeness and trust and influence with both these major powers. But at the same time, we must be sceptics, America sceptics and China sceptics. To survive in a Chinese world, we're going to have to say no to China. But if we can have that closeness and trust, yet affirm our own standards and not walk past China's when we disagree, the relationship will survive just as it has with the Americans when we've said no to them. Gough Whitlam would have understood. I sat with him in Beijing, together with Graham Freudenberg, in 1971, when Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai tried to draw him into repudiating the US alliance, and he said no, in public, in front of Chinese, Australian and international media, and yet came away with China's agreement to diplomatic relations. China's acceptance of that no, reaffirmed last month by Foreign Minister Wang Yi, has been a given in our relations ever since. Thank you all, and thank you, Gough.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that frank, thoughtful and very practical assessment. As another former Australian diplomat, I have to say what you said about the need for Australia to better listen, learn and persuade really strikes a chord. So thank you again. And I now invite Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Denise Kirkpatrick, to give the official thank you tonight. Denise?
Dr. Stephen FitzGerald, in his absence, Uncle Greg Sims, members of the Whitlam family, distinguished guests and friends. I'd like to thank Uncle Greg for his welcome to this country, and I would like to acknowledge the Darug people on whose lands we gather and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to pay my respects to those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends and colleagues who are here with us this evening. It is my privilege this evening to offer this brief vote of thanks on behalf of Western Sydney University and the board of the Whitlam Institute. Ours is a young university, established as such just over 25 years ago, but with an unbroken educational line back to 1891 with the founding of the Hawkesbury Agricultural College. We seek to be a university of the people, committed to access and excellence, convinced that education is the door to opportunity for the individual student and the cornerstone of an open, fair and tolerant society. Western Sydney University today is the educational home to over 44,000 students, of whom more than 60% are the first in their families to attend university. Our teaching and research spreads across 10 campuses, including our campus in Ho Chi Minh City and our new state-of-the-art vertical campus, which opened earlier this year just down the road in the Parramatta CBD. Our national reputation and international standing are growing, as do our ambitions. We are among the top 100 young universities in the world and in the top 3% of universities worldwide. It is particularly fitting that this evening's oration should be held here in Western Sydney, one of the most culturally diverse regions in the country. Our university reflects this, with its students drawn from over 160 different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Over 16,000 of the university's total student population were born in countries other than Australia, and more than 15,500 of the university's students speak a language other than English at home. When Gough Whitlam was elected as the member for Rowera in 1952, his electorate covered a large part of the footprint of our university, and he was an early advocate for its establishment. It was in 2000 that Gough Whitlam entered into agreements with the university for the establishment of the Whitlam Institute. Suffice to say that he was proud of what the Whitlam Institute was becoming, and I'm confident in suggesting that he would be even more so today. In September 2012, Stephen FitzGerald wrote a paper, a part memoir, as he described it, for the Whitlam Institute to mark the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. In this, he tells the story of a lunch in Hong Kong with Henry Lytton. Lytton, an old friend of Stephen's, was at that time a QC and subsequently a judge of Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeals. It was June 1971. Gough Whitlam and the Labor delegation were in Hong Kong, tensely awaiting the issuing of visas for their historic visit to the People's Republic. During the course of the conversation, Gough said to Lytton, "When we win government, I'm going to send him," pointing to Stephen FitzGerald, "to China as our ambassador." As Stephen says in recounting the story, this was the first I'd learned of it. The story says a great deal about the times, about the passions and enthusiasms, the sense of living on the brink of momentous historical changes, about the personal relationships among those Gough regarded as his most trusted comrades. We can be certain that this was no throwaway line on Gough's part. Stephen FitzGerald was the obvious candidate. It is close on 45 years since Australia's recognition of China and Stephen FitzGerald's appointment as ambassador. As is apparent from this evening's oration, the fires still burn hot. The ambitions for a confident and independent Australian foreign policy, bred of deep, respectful relations within our region and with our traditional allies, remain unquenched. Yet, listening to Stephen this evening, it would seem that while the ambitions are unquenched, the challenge is, if anything, all the more imperative. When it was established in 2011, the Gough Whitlam Oration may have seemed something of an anachronism, a 45-minute uninterrupted address in the age of 20-second grabs and 140-character news items. Stephen, your address this evening affirms our conviction that for all of the benefits of new digital era, there remains an important place for an extended, critical, informed and consciously developed argument, which is this evening's oration is compelling. While not shying away from the disappointed dreams of where we might have been and the difficulties of our contemporary circumstances, it offers for our collective consideration a way forward. Stephen, we are indebted to you, not only for this evening's timely and undoubtedly significant oration, but for your years of public service. Stephen, we have a small gift for you by way of appreciation, if you'd like to join me. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Dr. Stephen FitzGerald.
Thank you so much.
It's a little heavy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And our final speaker this evening is the Institute's own Eric Sidoti. Eric?
Stephen FitzGerald, the Honourable Bob Hawke, distinguished guests, one and all. I was fortunate in having a preview of Stephen's oration, and on first reading it and again listening to it this evening, my thoughts could not help but turn to Edward Gough Whitlam. What on earth would he make of these times? In some sense, there is no need for conjecture, for we can go to the record. And Stephen draws upon the heritage, but I have to say one of the moments that kept recurring to me was Gough's response to Harold Holt's view that we should go all the way with LBJ, to which Gough mused, possibly there is nothing wrong with going all the way with LBJ, if you know where LBJ is going. When it comes to the philosophical underpinnings and the directions of the Whitlam government's foreign policy ambitions, Gough could claim with some justification, listening to Stephen tonight, that he was right again. We can be thankful to Stephen, not simply for his reminder, for also bringing to bear his knowledge, experience, expertise in putting before us the contemporary relevance of that thinking for Australia today in what is a very different world. An oration such as this is dependent on a lot of people, and so there are a few that warrant our thanks. To Uncle Greg for his gracious and warm welcome to country. Once again, to Robert Love and the staff here at Riverside Theatres, who have been the best of partners, patient, generous, professional and good-humoured throughout. This year, for the oration, we have been very fortunate to have the Saturday paper as our media partner, for the duration in the lead-up and on the night. Maury Schwartz, I know, had hoped to be here but couldn't make it this evening, but Fabien Béard is in the auditorium, and I'd ask him to extend our thanks to all concerned at Schwartz Media and the Saturday paper. And I understand there will be a free copy on the way out, so you can indulge in high-quality, long-form journalism. Thanks also to our university colleagues, the media unit, Mark Smith, Amanda Wibley, photographer extraordinaire, Sally Sutas, who's been around this evening, designers, and the security team, Brett Gibson and the crew. And finally, a special thank you to the Whitlam Institute team, all of whom are here this evening, but a particular word of thanks to Anna King, who project managed the whole event, and to Amy Sambrook and the comms team, and the admin team that backed all of that work in. We're very fortunate at the Institute to have a group of dedicated staff who, without fail, go the extra mile to make sure everything is just right. Many of you here this evening are long-standing friends and supporters of the Whitlam Institute, and there's no need to say too much about us. You're familiar with our work. For those who are not, I would simply say that our roots lie deeply in the social democratic tradition, and we are guided still by the three great aims of the Whitlam platform that so neatly encapsulate the essence of that tradition. Those three great aims being to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of the land, to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. We are, at the Institute, custodians of the Whitlam Prime Ministerial Collection, which now stands at over 35,000 items and one of the most significant collections in the country. We continue to receive donations, most recently a very significant additional gift from Graham Frudenberg, including his diaries from 1988 to 2014, and a rare leather-bound version of the Whitlam government with an inscription from the leader. Our public policy program continues to deepen, evidenced in part by public forums and our publication output, but just as importantly through less visible gatherings of scholars, policy makers and practitioners, whether it be our symposium last week on a future for vocational education and training, God knows it needs one, a briefing yesterday on our research on high-stakes testing in Australian schools, or next month's social democracy workshop with participants from 3 continents, for the first time the Whitlam workshop being hosted offshore in Chicago, co-hosted with DePaul University. We have several new projects in train. 2016 proved to be a breakthrough year for our civics education programs, with over 3,800 young people entering the What Matters writing competition, and indeed, for us, a very exciting development with over 1,300 primary age students participating in a one-day civics program through a collaboration with Liverpool City Council and Mission Australia. All 1,300 came from Miller 2168. Our visitor numbers, as we try to take another step in our ambitions to make the home of the Whitlam Institute at the Female Orphan School a genuinely intellectual and cultural centre right here in the heart of the West, we have made a little progress, not as much as we want, but our visitor numbers last year cracked 13,000, which was 50% up on the year before. And this year we're extending the opening hours of the Margaret Whitlam Galleries, the permanent exhibition, the public events and heritage tours, with a Saturday opening every second Saturday of the month, in addition to our Thursdays and Friday openings. And I should say we're delighted that the specially curated exhibition last year for the centenary of Gough's birth, The Way of the Reformer, has been picked up by the National Archives in Canberra and will be shown there from late July. And David Fricker is here from the National Archives this evening. A very close and very worthwhile partnership that we enjoy with them. We're conscious that we are here for the long haul, and these are but early days. Nevertheless, we must even now be planning for where we want to go. Critical to this is the continuing renewal at every level of our relatively small organisation. At the board level, Cameron Klein took up a seat mid-year. In November, we fared well to Geoffrey Robertson, a foundation board member and who chaired the Whitlam Institute through 10 years, a time when it was steering it through some challenging events and saw it through to the other side. And just a few weeks ago, we announced the appointment of 2 new board members, Amanda Mackenzie and Rebecca Huntley. Rebecca is here with us this evening and actually understands what tweeting was all about, as you see this here. But it is for us an exciting period. We've announced recently the confirmation of the Honourable Margaret Wilson former New Zealand Attorney-General and Professor of Law at Waikato University as a Distinguished Fellow to the Institute, and Dr. Edward Nick Carr, Associate Professor of Economics at Roanoke College in Virginia as a Fellow of the Institute. In the Secretariat, we have been delighted to have join us on staff Leanne Smith, our MC this evening, our inaugural Associate Director. While our constant challenge is the fact that the opportunities outstrips our capacity, in 2016 we were able to establish the E.G. Whitlam Endowment with modest initial contributions of $86,000 and very secure pledges for a further $240,000. The endowment is a small beginning. It is symbolic in many respects, but it is recognition that we are building an institution that will live well beyond our times, serving our children's children and for generations to come. Ours is a national institution and we are deeply conscious of our responsibilities to the men and women of Australia. High among these responsibilities is the development of intellectually rigorous public policy and a commitment to nurturing civil, if robust, public discourse. In this respect, this evening's Gough Whitlam Oration well and truly fits the bill. There is more, much more I could say, but for the moment it remains only for me to thank you for braving the weather, for coming and sharing with us what I think will prove to be a very significant contribution to a debate on Australian foreign policy, and we do hope we shall see you again before too long.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formal proceedings for the evening. You're very welcome to join us outside in the foyer for some more refreshments. I would ask you, though, if you wouldn't mind staying seated for a moment while the official party leaves the auditorium, and we'll see you outside soon. So thank you again and safe travels home. Good night.